Okay, we're going to get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for our Gatsby in Connecticut. I'm going to introduce Richard Webb as author, award-winning educator, and documentary filmmaker. A graduate of Vanderbilt University, he has taught history for 24 years at both the high school and college levels. A featured presenter at the Connecticut Public Broadcasting Prohibition documentary, Connecticut Goes Dry. Webb is also a co-creator and co-producer with Robert Williams of a documentary film about the Fitzgeralds in Connecticut, Gatsby in Connecticut, which is a current companion to the book Boats Against the Current. And for those wondering, we do have both the book and the DVD in our catalog, so we'll have links to those on our website. All right, Richard, I'll let you take it away. Thanks for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you to Fredericksburg. I was talking to Michelle. It's one of my favorite historic sites. Been there many, many times. I'm a Civil War buff, so this is really an honor today to do this. I'm right now sitting in Westport, Connecticut, and I grew up a quarter of a mile away from the Fitzgerald's honeymoon cottage when they were there in the summer of 1920. And right now I live about a mile away. So I'm an old timer here in Westport. And just to let you know, I'll be making 3 transitions. I'm going to be showing you a series of images. Then I'll be transitioning to another series of images, and then I'll be transitioning to a video clip from our award-winning documentary, Gatsby in Connecticut. We're very proud that we were in the Cannes Film Festival, virtual, of course. We've been in many, many others. But New York Magazine published its top 36 films of 2020. These are all the films that were made in America in 2020, and we clocked in at number 30. So I think you're really going to enjoy this. This is a story that obviously you're interested in Scott or Zelda or Gatsby, but it's also a story about perseverance. It's also a story about not ever accepting the status quo, and it's about challenging authority. And before I start, I want to kind of put this into a historical perspective. When Scott and Zelda were here in the summer of 1920, they faced 3 identical challenges that we do today. It's rather incredible. Talk about history repeats itself. Number 1, global pandemic. The only protection was masks. And not to make light of COVID, as you would know, but that killed 50 million people worldwide. So that's one thing that they're having to coexist with. The other one was the worst race riots in American history since the Civil War, 32 American cities, mass lynchings. And that coincided with the rise of the largest membership of the KKK. It was in the 1920s, actually. It was not Civil War, post-Civil War. So that was the biggest peak of white supremacy. So we've seen a lot of white supremacist movement happening there. The third thing, and there was a fourth coming up, so I'll refer to that, but the third thing was the collapse of the economy. And at that time, it was called, the panic of, it was called the Depression. It was a global economic epidemic from 1919 to 1920. At the time, Americans referred to it as the Great Depression because the Great Depression hadn't happened yet. And there was a fourth thing that was emerging, and that was the great debate about whether or not to trust science. So that's pretty topical too. The Scopes monkey trial was just a few years down the road. So I want to thank Michelle in the Fredericksburg Library, and let's get started. Yeah, Michelle, if you could bring up the PowerPoint.
Okay, I've got that, but I'm not seeing your PowerPoint yet.
Okay, hold on. Got it?
All right. Yep, we've got it.
Okay, so let me get started. Okay, well, you got to start off with the shameless plug, but actually the cover of this book is significant. These are the Fitzgeralds on their, it's actually not their honeymoon, it's when they come back to Westport, but we'll talk about that later. So, by the way, this is probably the most iconic of the Fitzgerald photographs that you will see of them if you Google them. There they are in their secondhand Marmon. And behind them is the honeymoon cottage, which still stands today. I'll be talking to you about that. When I started this research, I was told by one of the leading Fitzgerald academics, he said, Deej, that's my nickname, Deej, If you get Westport in the top 25 places important to the Fitzgeralds, it's a noble and it's a lost cause. However, what I did by researching, now keep in mind how much research, scholarship has gone into Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald and the Great Gatsby, and everybody missed this. Not only was it in the top 25, it was number one. They wrote about it more than any other place they lived, and you're going to see that pretty spectacularly today. It shows up, okay, in Scott's Beautiful and Damned and in Zelda's Save Me the Waltz. By the way, both have parallel storylines. It's about two young married couples on their honeymoon in Connecticut. So they borrowed straight out of their own experiences. The stories are identical but different. And as Scott famously said, and I'll be repeating this in this presentation, all my characters are F.Scott Fitzgerald. Okay, so you're going to see that too. And most of his female characters were Zelda. Zelda's only novel, influenced by Westport. Zelda's only play, Scandelabra, took the premise of The Beautiful and Damned and reversed it. 5 of Scott's short stories feature Westport. One of his major little short stories, The Cruise of the Rolling Junk, which we'll get to later, also Westport, and of course, fabulously, The Great Gatsby. And here they are. They were so attractive. Now, they're America's first pop stars. This is the birth of mass media. Many people think, that was Babe Ruth by the mid-1920s, but it was the Fitzgeralds. As Dorothy Parker said, they looked like they had stepped straight out of the sun. They were relentlessly pursued by the media, and their antics were recorded usually on a daily basis. One of my favorite stories, however, this is their wedding day, is they managed to get kicked out of the city of New York. Now, I live 50 miles away from New York, and I'm a historian. I have never heard of anybody being kicked out of the city that never sleeps before, during, or since. So let me tell you what happened. They get married in April, St. Patrick's Cathedral. They stay in New York for 5 weeks. They get kicked out of the 2 great hotels, the Biltmore and the Commodore. And the last straw was when they abused a brand new invention called the revolving door. And they revolved in it for 30 minutes, not allowing, giggling, laughing, not allowing anybody to enter or exit the hotel. So what do? They buy a secondhand Marmot down in Manhattan, and they get on the Boston Post Road, and they're on their way to Lake Champlain. Why? Well, as Scott said, if Zelda can't swim, she's miserable. So they wanted to go where there was water. But en route, they found out that the water in Lake Champlain was too cold. So what do? They literally blindly hang a right off the Boston Post Road, and they end up in Westport, Connecticut, where he writes the majority of this novel. Again, it's showing you in a very spectacular fashion that he wrote straight out of his life here and barely fictionalized it. What I loved he said about the cover of this book was he said, the artist did the girl pretty well. He goes, but that's a pretty debauched version of me. And the reason I got all into this story was at the age of 14, I would ride my bike around my neighborhood, and I was aware of their home. And I read at 14, The Beautiful and the Damned, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was a roadmap of Westport. Characters were taking a left here. They were taking a right here. They were going to this bridge, that bridge, turning around here and there. And I thought I had discovered something, amazing until somebody had the audacity to invent the internet. And then I found out that that was the case. So I also thought about Gatsby. So 2 years later, when I was 16 and I read Gatsby, and I was like, geez, there's something here that looks familiar, but I couldn't really put it together until I had some spectacular help. And I'll be talking about that later on in the presentation. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm an ex-teacher. I'm going to do some bad teaching. I'm going to talk over while you have to read something. And the reason I'm going to do that, and I'll give you time to read in a little bit more time, is because I want to move through The Beautiful and Damned fast, because I know you want to get to Gatsby. But the reason I'm starting with The Beautiful and Damned is it's the dry run for the Great Gatsby. Again, writing is a very hard thing. What did Scott do? He plagiarized from his own experiences. So he took stuff from The Beautiful and Damned. By the way, it's his least read novel. You can win, bonus points for reading it, and then you can really impress people by saying it's the dry run for the Great Gatsby. So here he just describes the house that they rented. Now this is where Gloria and Anthony Patch, who are Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald, rent the house, and there it is. It's still there. I lead very popular Gatsby walking tours of Westport. 4 miles, two and a quarter hours walking through some of the most beautiful geography in the country. But here he is describing the house as a pre-revolutionary house. It was owned by the Gray family. It was painted gray then, and it's still painted gray today. It's identical to when they were here. Here you see the side porch on the left. That's in a couple of famous photos of them. The side porch on the right was added on, and it's been added on into the back, but the entire core of the house is spectacularly still present. Now, don't worry about this, okay? Right now, this looks like a giant broccoli salad to you, all right? But I'll guide you through it. All right, this is a Google Earth map of where the Fitzgeralds lived, and the route that Zelda took when she ran out of a party that they were having and ran all the way to the train station. Scott, horrified, went right after her and followed her all the way to the train station. And this is exactly what Gloria Patch does in the book and what Anthony Patch does in the book. So if you just look at the bottom right, here's the Fitzgerald house. By the way, where was it? It was on the corner of a 175-acre mystery millionaire estate. Much more on that later. So what happens in the story? What happened in real life? They threw parties that started Thursday night, and everybody was supposed to leave by Sunday morning, but they stayed till Wednesday morning, and then the entire vicious cycle started again. Keep in mind, she's 19, and he's 24. So they're very, very young. So one of their parties, one of Scott's kind of hulking ex-Princeton friends, starts to hit on Zelda. And she's afraid she's going to get assaulted. And she runs out of the house. And so she runs out of the house from here, up to the road here, down this road here, over to here, over the train bridge, and to the train station. So let me take you through this a little bit more in detail right now. Okay. So again, Fitzgerald is writing straight out of his life. And what I'm doing here is I'm showing you short little air-lifted quotes out of here, but it's much more described and it's much more step and step. So she goes out of the house and she goes down 244 South Campo Road. And here, indeed, just a half mile of the road, this barn still stands. And at that time, it was the only house between where they lived and Marietta, the fictionalized town of Westport. By the way, that's my bike there in the background because that's what I use to lead some of my biking tours. So again, step by step, he's describing what Zelda did. It was a stormy, rainy night. She then turns the road down by the barn, enters the wood. The moon comes out, okay, and you have this longitudinal gleam of moonlight. And I'll give you a second to read this because this is where the worm turns. All right, I love it. Scott's beautiful lyrical writing describing these towers, which still exist. This is a modern photo, as a gigantic spider. But look at what he test drives in this book. The single most important color in 20th century American fiction, the green light, which represents Gatsby's dream. And of course, in a larger sense, represents the American dream, as every kid who's read the novel is taught. So here he is already trying it out, right? So that's why The Beautiful and Damned, and in many other ways, I'm just kind of showing you the big point here, is a dry run for The Great Gatsby. She runs across the river on the track. What I love is that Fitzgerald describes the pedestrian walkway to the left that you see as being a yard wide in The Beautiful and Damned. And yes, I go so down the rabbit hole of this. I measured it. It's exactly 3 feet wide today. So it's all still there. You get halfway down the bridge and you take a look at right. Now, remember, 95 is not there at that time, obviously. But you see Westport in the background. Now, back then, Westport was largely deforested. This is 1920 again. And it was still agrarian farmland. So you would have seen the whole town. So again, he's just writing straight out of his experience. And what I love is what Scott and Zelda used to do was they would go to the train station. You can still see it there. And the station house is still there today, just like it was then. And what Scott and Zelda used to do was they would sit on top of the roof after many an all-nighter and wait for the first train to New York City, which was the 5:33. And by the way, it took 70 minutes to get to New York from Westport in 1920. And frankly, you're pretty lucky if it only takes you that today. Okay, so just wanted to give you a little bit of a flavor of how they were using their own lives, which Scott repeatedly did. Again, all my characters are F.Scott Fitzgerald. Set it up with The Beautiful and Damned, so you could see how that influenced Gatsby. So let's get to Gatsby. So Michelle, I'm going to make a transition here. All right. And give me a second. Let's see if we can get this. Window. Yeah, this is, no, that's not what I want. I don't want that one. Okay, so hold on. We do know what we're doing. We're getting close. Okay, share. And thanks, people, for, well, first, for watching Zoom, because everybody must be so zoomed out. I think there's a new definition for that, but luckily, I think that's ending. So I know that you can see this. So here we go. Okay.
Try again. Try again. I think we lost the share screen.
Okay. Yeah.
They get canceled.
What? With me, it's possible.
Let's give it another shot.
Got it?
Add to stream. Yes.
All right. Perfect. All right. Nice. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much. Okay, again, by the way, I came out with the second edition, the Centennial edition, with some new research and information, because last year was the 100th anniversary, literally, that they had been here. We had so many things planned, but obviously, you know, that that never happened. But, you know, so it shall be. By the way, this is a limited edition, and it's a truly limited edition, and let me tell you why. I will only be able in my lifetime, or in the lifetime of this book, to be able to publish 2,500 copies. And this is the reason why. There are pictures in here that have never been seen before of the Fitzgeralds and of many other things. The deal was the Fitzgerald estate is very rightfully protective of copyright, and it's not cheap to use the images. But they were very kind to me. They believed in what I was doing, and so the deal was, you know, do it in this book. You can't make an e-version of it. Do it in this book. You can sell 2,500. You make 2,500, but no more after that. So truly, it's a limited edition. Not trying to make you buy it, but that's just the fact behind the story. Here they are again. Again, she's 19. He's 24 when he's here. Now, I referred earlier how I thought, you know, in a general way, I thought, wow, Westport's in Gatsby, but I couldn't put it together until somebody gave me this article in the New Yorker, the September 1996 issue, titled Westport Wildlife. By the way, it's online. You know, you can check out for yourself. It was written by Barbara Prout-Solin, who you see to your right. She passed away, sadly, not too long ago, but she passed a lot happier because of what we did with her story. Now, what happened was she grew up across from the mystery millionaire estate, and you're about to learn who he is, where Scott and Zelda lived. She grew up directly across that. And her house was spectacular. They had the longest light in the water at that point. It had a green light at the end of it. So she began to actively research the story. She came up with a wonderful hypothesis. The problem was, and again, this is why my book is, boats gets occurrence in the last sentence of Gatsby, so that was one reason. The other reason was to try to prove this theory was such a fight. And when Barbara came up with this theory, the problem was she challenged the #1 Fitzgerald academic. Now, his theory was it was Great Neck, Long Island, which everybody thinks, and by the way, it is. Great Neck and Westport are a beachy blend in Gatsby. But Matthew Broccoli, who is the historic leading Fitzgerald biographer, and by the way, I highly recommend him. Some of the best stuff written on the Fitzgeralds is by Broccoli, but he was wrong on this count. But here was the great hubris that happened. He put pressure, because it went against his theory, that it was all about Great Neck and not Westport. He put pressure on the New Yorker not to advertise it, not to republish it, and in essence, he killed this article. So I decided, as part of my quest, that I was going to validate what Barbara did. Okay, well, here is the 175-acre estate. That's not all 175 acres of the mystery millionaire. And on the next slide, I'll describe exactly who he is. Now, I'm going to point out about 3 or 4 elements in this photo that I'm going to be referring to later. So if you could just try to follow along. I know it's not easy, but if you could just try to follow along. Here's the house. It still exists today, as I'll show you, in its entirety. All right. Here was a path that the Fitzgeralds, now the Fitzgeralds lived on the edge of this estate, and they would often walk up this path here, go to the swimming pool here, attend parties here, and concerts at the band shell. They would also go over to here to one of his 3 beaches. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about some of the time the Fitzgeralds spent here. Here is the mansion. Here's the beach where I'll be talking about some naughty things that Zelda did. And here is a tower and a boathouse complex. And we're going to be talking about both of these. Now, by the way, this is an aerial shot taken in the summer of 1920. Now, look, there were no drones. The airplane was new. How did he get it? Well, it was a U.S. Navy blimp that he requested stop. It was going from New York to Newport, Rhode Island, and he requested that it hover over his property and take photos. Now, that means he had a lot of clout, and he did with the U.S. Navy, and you're going to see spectacularly why, because they owed him. All right, there he is. This is F.E. Lewis on his left. His younger days, he's on the back porch of Longshore, which is the estate I just showed you, titled Longshore because it had a mile of shorefront. It was literally a long shore. There he is, middle-aged at the height of his powers. And on the right, I'm going to be referring back to this picture. He's at the helm of one of his many, many boats he had at Longshore, 14 to be exact, and he's wearing a cowboy hat. Now, yes, you would not think that people at sea would wear a cowboy hat, but there is a very fascinating story as to why he is. Okay, here's the house. Again, these are all pictures from a private photo album I was able to incredibly access from the Lewis family. This is the front of the estate. And, it's a mansion. It may not match up with the film version view that you might have of Gatsby's mansion. where it kind of is this big Roman turreted French chateau sort of thing. And indeed, in one point of the novel, it's described in that sort of way. But critically, at the end of the novel, the very end, Nick Carraway describes that he goes back to Gatsby's ramshackle of a house. And what we argue is you're looking at a house here that's a bit ramshackle. It's got a lot of add-ons. It's got a few competing architectural styles. So Fitzgerald used this. And by the way, this is the first mansion he's really exposed to in his entire life on the East Coast. All right. He's not going to go to Great Neck for another 2.5 years. All right. Here is Longshore today. The core of the building is intact. They have added on a nose job of the Longshore Inn. You can rent rooms now. It's getting refurbished. And in the back is a giant restaurant. And what it's been turned into is a wonderful town-owned public venue with swimming pools and tennis courts and an 18-hole golf course that is ranked the 9th best in Connecticut. And Longshore, where the inn and F.E. Lewis's house and the restaurant is the #1 wedding destination in Connecticut. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to look at the top center, the very top center of this photo over this tree. And you're going to see this sea of masts. All right, so this is the Saugatuck Harbor Yacht Club. But when Barbara Probst Solomon lived here, this was the Solomons' private marina, and the Great Marsh estate that they lived in encompassed what is now the territory of 6 properties. All right, they had a gas pump on the property. The lawn and yards and specimen trees were sculpted by Frederick Law Olmsted. And what was spectacular was I was able to do, by looking at 1934 aerial photographs of this entire inlet area, and I was able to see that the Solomons did have the longest dock in the vicinity, that there was a green light at the end of it, and even more spectacularly, they had a lighthouse. So by the way, where was that dock? It came about right here. And this is where Scott and Zelda swam. So literally, as the crow flies. It's built up today. It's no longer a beach, but it was a beautiful sandy beach. And Lewis would import sand to his 3 beaches. Now, in 1917, this is the entrance to Longshore. And these are still there. In 1917, Lewis built a giant wall with 2 big giant posts as the entrance. And big giant posts, by the way, are known as posterns. Fitzgerald puts us straight into Gatsby. Nick Carraway says famously, instead of taking the shortcut by the Sound, what he was referring to was getting to Gatsby's mansion. And what Scott and Zelda did was they took a shortcut to the mansion and the beach and the pools and the parties. But sometimes they walked down the road and they did go in the formal entrance. So what does Scott do? He uses this straight in Gatsby. Again, Nick Carraway, instead of taking the shortcut by the Sound, we went down the road a ways and we entered by the great posterns. So there they are. And this is a very, very popular stop when I do my Gatsby walking tours. All right. Well, look at this Gatsby-esque party scene. This is the summer of 1920. We have partygoers around the pool. The pool has had lily pads put in it just especially for this party. And you see I love the 1920s men with their white duck summer pants. And so Scott and Zelda attended many of these parties. And you see the dancers up on the band shell. And in front is a full jazz band. And Scott puts this straight into Gatsby, where Nick says Gatsby had a jazz band and that it was no mean affair, meaning like it wasn't small. It wasn't just, a drum and a cornet and a trumpet. It was a full-blown multi-instrument band. And here you see, that's exactly what you have here. Now, if this isn't straight out of The Great Gatsby, I don't know what is. Again, this is the property of F.E. Lewis, and this is where Scott and Zelda cut through to go swim at the beach. Remember what Scott said, if Zelda can't swim, she's miserable. All right, I'll be talking more about what else was on this property. Lewis was a big equestrian, as I'll be showing you very impressively later. He had fireproof stables. So he built all these wonderful riding trails. By the way, they're all still there today. So it was always full of horses coming to and fro, including a very famous one, but we'll get to that. All right, well, here's why he's wearing a cowboy hat in that shot of him behind one of his 14 boats at Longshore. That's Lewis on the right, okay? Because he owned an 8,000-acre ranch in the town of Spadra, California. And he would winter there and spring, summer, and fall in Westport. Now, there he is on top of one of his champion studs. What that is it's an Arabian horse. They were unheard of in the United States at the time. Those that knew of them didn't like them. They've got a unique look. If you want to look up on the internet, their heads are very, very different than the horse that you're probably familiar with. But he liked them. He brought them to the country and singularly popularized them. Matter of fact, his major stud, Buffalo Bill Cody, purchased, and Musan was used by Buffalo Bill Cody at all his Wild West shows. Now, to the left, that is an advertisement to come to a sale of champion Duroc hogs. Duroc hogs were highly desirable hogs, and this is on his 8,000-acre ranch. This is just a picture of his housing and feeding facilities for his livestock. It was so groundbreaking, by the way, his methods are still used today. At this 8,000-acre estate, it was so large that he had to build a halfway house with a railroad, private railroad, the halfway house, because you would travel for 4,000 acres and then spend the night and see the other 4,000 acres. He used his brand for his livestock was a diamond over a bar. That was the shape of the brand that he used. And he decided to call his estate Diamond Bar Ranch. Well, this is now the entire city of Diamond Bar, California. Famous alumni, Alexis Morgan, the great soccer player, and the great rapper Snoop Dogg. Where did he get his money? Well, at the age of 21, Lewis inherited the equivalent of $240 million in today's money. And where did he get the money? What's the money trail? His direct ancestor was a guy by the name of Moses Taylor. Yeah, and I hadn't heard of him either. But turns out Moses Taylor was one of the biggest bankers in American history. And actually, he's the 21st richest American to this day, listed in places like Fortune magazine and CelebrityWorth.net. Okay, we're back to Longshore now. Here's the tower that I was talking to you about in that previous aerial photo. And to the right here, we'll talk about next, right? This is a big boathouse complex. But by talking about this tower, Fitzgerald uses this straight in Gatsby too. As Nick says, Gatsby's guests were diving from the tower of his raft. Now, what this was, at high tide, you could swim here, but he also had two giant swimming platforms out here. So again, Fitzgerald uses this. This is, again, as you can see to the left, this is a beach. This is the second of his three beaches. So again, Fitzgerald recycles this straight into Gatsby. Gatsby's guests were diving from the tower, and there it is. Now here's the boathouse complex. So this is where the story starts to really get bigger and bigger and bigger. All right, So this is where he would stick his boats in for winter storage, where he would haul them in for repairs. These spars were used to raise the lighter ones in, and this was massive. You're just seeing the front and part of the side of this complex. It was a massive, top of the line, newest technology boathouse. And parked usually in front of it was this. Now, that was his main yacht, the Kima. It had a crew of 55. It burned 4 tons of coal at sea a day. It cost $1.5 million to keep just at the dock. And what you're going to notice is that there's U.S. Navy sailors on here. So here we go back to the U.S. Navy stopping over his house in the blimp. What he did, he owned this for just several months, and then he donated it to the U.S. Navy for use in World War I. And what it did was it patrolled Battery Park in New York City against U-boat incursions in World War I. When the war's over, FE just tells the U.S. Navy, hey, you know what? Just keep it. Just keep it. It's yours. Now, here he is with just 4 of his boats that were there, and he's at the helm of the 5th. You saw the big one, the 6th previously, and he had 8 more. And one of the things I like to predicate is that he's also the template for Dan Cody. This is where Gatsby in the novel has his first taste of wealth. He's a crewman on Dan Cody's yacht. And this is where he says, you know what? This is what I want in life. Well, what's interesting is this is Scott's first exposure to yachts when he's on his honeymoon in Westport, Connecticut, including that spectacular one that I just showed you. So again, there now you see why he's got a cowboy hat on, because he's got that ranch in California. Not pictured were 2 of his speedboats, triple 500 horsepower engines, Allison aircraft engines. They were the fastest boats imaginable, and they were known as hydroplanes. Okay, and Gatsby again famously says to Nick, hey, old sport, why don't you come down and we'll take a spin in my hydroplane around the Sound. Well, what's very interesting about Fitzgerald's use of the word hydroplane is, of course, that's supposed to let you know that Gatsby's really wealthy because he's got this really powered, giant, fast speedboat, the best in the country, but it also has a double meaning. So hang on to that term hydroplane. So again, we've got a major rancher, major livestock of champion livestock, a major horse breeder, major millionaire by today, would be in the billions by the time he actually retired, and a tremendous boating enthusiast. So he kind of actually out Gatsby's Gatsby. He's bigger than Gatsby. Yeah, this is one of his later boats. They didn't get smaller. This is the Stranger, and you'll notice it's out of Los Angeles. So this is the one he kept on the West Coast. He had 7 of these over his lifetime. Not all at the same time, but you buy a new one every so often. And they were all named Stranger. And this is taken in 1938. Now, why is this in the presentation? In 1938, he took a deep sea cruise to Southeast Asia. It was a marine biology experimentation expedition. For example, he brought back the first seals to the San Francisco Zoo. But on this, it was also a covert spying mission for the US government. In 1938, what he did was he surreptitiously spied on Japanese naval and air installations, Philippines, Guam, places like that. And indeed, the Japanese would attack America 3 years later at Pearl Harbor. So, you can see that F.E. Lewis was quite the patriot. All right. Here is off the estate of F.E. Lewis, Longshore, Westport, Connecticut. One of his, hydro water planes, seaplane. Okay, so Fitzgerald was using two things in a single word to connotate wealth: a high-powered speedboat and something very rare. Now, keep in mind, the airplane had just been invented. To have it, so that's incredibly rare. To have a seaplane is unbelievably rare at that time. All right. So with Fitzgerald, keep in mind that The Great Gatsby is like 47,000 words. That's it. It's really concise. And by the way, as a writer, it's very difficult to write something that short. Mark Twain had a great line: "Sorry for writing you a long letter. I didn't have time to write you a short one." Because you got to focus, you got to make it concise. So when Fitzgerald uses the term hydroplane, it's supposed to connotate a double meaning, that this guy has got these two incredible toys. By the way, if you had both of these today, it's kind of like having an Elon Musk rocket on your property. All right, here he is. He's there. That's his chauffeur at Longshore. That's his first wife. By the way, he had four wives, the last one of which was the 18-year-old daughter of his college roommate. So I wonder how that went. But anyway, so I discovered, now, by the way, when I started researching F.E. Lewis, there was a single sentence in the entire internet on him. That's how much of a mystery millionaire he was. And it was oblique because he was being investigated for his holdings in a New York City bank. It was like 1910. It was the Progressive era. He didn't do anything illegal, but the government was looking into the excesses of capitalism, so they were investing banks. But I started to find all this stuff by reading these motoring magazines from 1907. That's how much I got into this rabbit hole. Okay. Frankly, I'm kind of crazy, but crazy for the right reason, I like to think. From 1907 to 1915, he was a car racer. And I mean, at the highest levels. Now, I would love to tell you he came in first place, but he never did. But he came in third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. One of my favorite stories is in a race in Massachusetts. He loses to a car in 1907 that was going at a top speed of 40 miles an hour. Such were cars in 1907. All right. But he went on to own three of the most expensive cars in America. At Longshore, he had two matching cars that had a value of today of about $175,000. He had a third one, a different custom-made, beautiful, beautiful touring car that today would have cost $250,000. And at one point, he ordered a custom-made Cadillac with reinforced suspension, and he attempted to make a trip from Westport, Connecticut, out to Diamond Bar, California. Now, again, keep in mind this, at that time, that was about 1917. This was unheard of. It was the United States, most of it was literally almost impassable by road. There weren't any, it was like traveling the lunar surface. There were no motels. Those would come on later in the 20s. So in his custom Cadillac, he brought a bedroll, and his intent was he would spend the night on his cross-country trek to California on the side of the road with his bedroll. Well, 50 miles outside of Westport, it breaks down. Well, when you're a multi-millionaire, that's not really an issue, because what do? Well, you order a couple of train cars, you attach it to a train that's coming through, you load your car on one, and you sleep in your own Pullman luxury car, and you continue by rail out to California. So, speed racer, car enthusiast, livestock breeding champion, horse breeding champion, seaplane, yacht owner. Again, even Gatsby didn't have this much. All right. In 1917, he threw the biggest party in Connecticut history to this day, and it's got to be one of the most spectacular in American history. This is some of the local coverage of it. And I'm going to give you some time to read the major print in the top left and take a look at the picture in the top right. Okay, well, we've told you that F.E. Lewis was a patriotic guy, and here's going to be a really spectacular example of this. This was a World War I fundraiser that he hosted at his estate in 1917. And just to give you kind of an intro, 800 cars were parked at this event in 1917. Now, you got to understand, the car is a brand new invention. I don't even know how many cars were in the state of Connecticut at that time, but 800 at a single party, that's off the charts. Off the charts. And he brings in the most famous entertainment of the era. And all these different events are happening at once on this day. Okay, so Aero Club to carry passengers skyward. All right, so what you could do if you were a party goer was you could take a ride in an airplane. Now, let's put this into perspective. Imagine you're one of the 88 billion Americans that say that you came over on the Mayflower. Your family came over in 1620. Okay, so keep in mind, this is now 300 years later. And you think of all those 12, 15 generations of your family, and you are the very first that is going to fly. A generational first in the 300-year history of your American family. That has to leave an impression. Ina Claire is in a musical there. Now, who's Ina Claire? She's pictured there. Fitzgerald's favorite actress. He had pictures of her all over his dorm room. And in 1934, when Hollywood was going to make a film version of Tender is the Night, he wanted her to play Nicole. She's the most famous actress also in cinematic history, too, because she was the first naturalistic, realistic actress, as opposed to the Edwardian declamatory sort of style. Who directs her? Well, his ghost, David Belasco's theater, is still said to haunt the Belasco Theater in New York to this day. If you go to a play, if you go to a musical, the entire template of stage design and lighting design, he invented. He invented it, still used to this day. John Philip Sousa was the biggest single musical act of the time, king of the march music. He comes in with his entire band. Not only that, but he writes a song specifically for the event. Houdini comes. Now, getting Houdini, what a catch. Now, Houdini was usually pushed off a dock in a box with chains, and he would escape. But Lewis wanted to make it even more spectacular. So Lewis had a crane that he would lift his boats in and out of the marina. So what does he do? He puts Houdini in the box that's chained, puts him on the end of a hook on the crane, and lowers him deep out into Long Island Sound. And of course, Houdini managed to escape. So who else is there? Annette Kellerman. Now, Annette Kellerman invented she did, charity swim lessons because she invented the sport of synchronized swimming. And more spectacularly for our Scott and Zelda story, she invented the most radical design of women's swimwear to date. And that was the one piece. This was radical. So Zelda preferred Annette Kellerman's swimwear. She loved the one piece because it was form hugging, and Zelda, frankly, liked to show off her body. She also intentionally picked this tan beige color that made her appear nude from afar, and she did that intentionally. That's Zelda for you, right? Okay. Marceline the Clown. Yeah, I hadn't heard of him either. But he's the biggest clown in definitely American history and probably world history. At the time, he was so famous, they did a comic strip after him called Marceline the Clown. In a time today where Celine Dion or Britney Spears might do a 1-year residency in Vegas, he did a 10-year residency at the largest venue in New York called the Hippodrome. But here's the kicker. The greatest single cinematic figure in world history, Charlie Chaplin, bar none. When he was asked, hey, how did you develop your act? He was straight up and honest. He says, I just copy Marceline. Now, here is probably the two biggest stories. Now, I'm leaving out a ton of other stuff. Other acts, other things, very famous in their day. They're obscure today, but very famous in their day. But we just don't have time. By the way, when I researched, I looked up all the society and banker types that were there and industrialists. The crowd was composed of some of the richest people in America, and I did the math, tens of billions of dollars in collective worth. But really, probably the big two standouts of this party was when he brought a whole circus from New York City to the property. He had half of them shipped out by barge, 50 miles by water from lower Manhattan, and they were landed on the beaches of Longshore. The other half he shipped by private train, and they were taken off in Westport and marched through town. Imagine the excitement of that. And so it was literally a 3-ring circus there. But here's really, I think this was, well, it was meant as the pièce de résistance to the party. So about midday during this all-day event, partygoers heard the distant rumble of hooves. And they look around, well, where's this coming from? And all of a sudden, over the crest of a hill, going at top speed, is a stagecoach being pulled by 6 Arabians. They are being chased in turn by Native Americans, who are being chased in turn by cowboys, led, of course, by F.E. Lewis in an all-white outfit with an all-white 10-gallon hat, who comes to the rescue. Here's the kicker to this story. That's a real Nevada mid-19th century stagecoach, Wells Fargo, that he had brought out from California for the party. Those were real cowboys from California. And I think the best of the story is that those were real Native Americans that he had shipped out here, that were only about a decade or two removed from the frontier. So needless to say, this was the first Indian people in Westport had ever seen. So a party that out Gatsby's Gatsby. So actually, when Fitzgerald uses F.E. Lewis as a template, he's bigger than Gatsby himself. So I think that's kind of fun, right? Because Gatsby is seen in American history, American literary history, as the epitome of wealth. But he didn't quite add up to F.E. Lewis. I'll give you a second to read these headlines from the summer of 1920 in Westport, Connecticut. These are from the local newspaper. I'll give you a few more seconds. Okay, and I'll be talking about 2 of these in detail. Well, it's all in the timing, folks. When Scott and Zelda come out here in 1920, it coincides spectacularly with the first year of Prohibition. Now, the town of Westport voted down in a mock election Prohibition by a 3-2 margin. Indeed, the state of Connecticut, along with the state of Rhode Island, were the only 2 states that never ratified Prohibition. Little known but important fact. And people, obviously, the next question is why? Well, because at that time, and at least as of 7 years ago, both these states had the largest per capita population of Italian Americans. and you are not going to take away the sacramental wine or the great tradition of growing your own grapes and making your own wine from the Italians. You're just not going to happen. And to really kind of push this point a little further, the Westport police at that time were comprised of 4 people. Now, 2 of them were Italian Americans. They had no interest in upholding the law. And I could say this because I'm very much Irish in many ways. The other 2 were Irish, and they had no interest in upholding prohibition. So all the busts that were made in town were made by the state police or the federal government. There was not a single local bust. So let me just point out 2 of these spectacular headlines. A truck carrying $17,000 worth of booze held up in town. By the way, it's on its way to Rhode Island. No shock. Just to let you know, that's $250,000, give or take, today. But my favorite story is the bottom left, when this taxi overturned downtown. Now, Westporters had noticed this taxi before, and they kind of noted that they never saw it at night. They only saw it during the day, and that it always stopped for gas. Well, when it overturned, they discovered why. Because the headlights were full of booze. They weren't functioning headlights. The fenders were full of booze. Okay? The wheel wells, the side panels, needless to say, the trunk, spare tire. And what they had done was they had soldered the gas tank in half, so half of it could carry booze. So they arrived in a town that arguably is the single most biggest violator of prohibition in the country. And doesn't that fit our hard partying 19-year-old Zelda and 24-year-old Scott? Now, I'll explain this more, but take a look at just the Miramar Inn. That's a very famous speakeasy. But what I'm going to ask you to do right now is to focus on that article on the left, done in the summer of 1920. Okay, so let me give you a little background on the Miramar. This is the most famous speakeasy between New York and Boston at the time, owned by an Italian American. What a shock. George Raft, Jimmy Cagney, Humphrey Bogart were frequent visitors. And as you see in the left article, by the way, the Miramar was about a mile from Scott's house. They are driving. They've probably been drinking already. Guaranteed they probably were. And Scott gets into an accident. And why do we care, you ask? Well, in Gatsby, in the largest party scene, one of the guests, while leaving his party, wrecks it. And how does Scott describe the wreck? That the guy loses a wheel. So Scott takes his own accident and identically places it in The Great Gatsby. Again, all my characters are F. Scott Fitzgerald. I'll just describe the man on the right in just a minute. Here's the Campo Inn on the left. That was the other major hotel speakeasy. By the way, down this very steep road, we have 2 eyewitness accounts of Zelda careening down the hood of a taxi cab, hanging on to the hood ornament for dear life. And in one of those 2 accounts, she's naked. You can pick whatever one's you're famous. Well, the guy on the right supplied the booze to the Campo Inn that was owned by his brother-in-law, actually. And the guy on the right is named Bald Jack Rose, notorious gambling house owner, speakeasy owner, named Bald Jack because he had alopecia, so he was hairless. He's the template for Meyer Wolfsheim in The Great Gatsby. You might remember the scene when Nick Carraway meets Meyer Wolfsheim along with Gatsby, and Meyer Wolfsheim tells the famous murder story of the murder of Rosie Rosenthal at the Metropole restaurant. Well, that's an actual event, and who was very much part of that was Bald Jack Rose as he turned state's evidence against a corrupt cop that had organized the hit. So again, we have Dan Cody, we've got Gatsby, and we've got Meyer Wolfsheim. Okay, take a second to just read these. Okay, so this is a hard partying place. Campo Beach, Scott and Zelda loved swimming there, Zelda especially. And on the private estate of F.E. Lewis, Scott and Zelda used to skinny dip. And famously, the great literary critic Edmund Wilson, friend of Scott's from Princeton, said that Scott and Zelda were engaged in the nude orgies of Westport. Here's just a picture of the house when it was sold in 1925 by a leading upscale magazine. This is our film. It's on all platforms. It's called Gatsby in Connecticut. Again, it's won multiple awards, and again was listed number 30 of the top 36 films in America by New Yorker magazine. The book, once again, and now I would love to show you a film clip. So we've got great. So you've got this, right? Yep.
So many
Yep,
people
we
are
can see
digging
it.
into who were the sources for Gatsby.
All right, let me just start it again.
Who was Jay Gatsby modeled on?
I find it interesting that so many people are digging into who were the sources for Gatsby. There have been some specific names proposed, and then there have been other theories, so we may never know.
I heard he was in oil from a man who knew all about him, grew up with him in Texas.
I knew somebody who grew up with him in St. Paul.
Well, you look at him sometimes when he doesn't know anyone's looking at him. You can see it in his eyes. I bet he did kill a man.
Which one is he?
Yes, there is something ultimately about Gatsby that we never quite know.
You're not supposed to be able to grasp it.
Right,
Yeah.
his essence, yeah.
But I don't think there's any one person who served as a model for Gatsby.
He took his experience, of course, as you're saying, it all comes from your own experience, but he blends different times of his life, different people he knew with himself, and creates composites. In fact, Hemingway wrote him a famous letter criticizing him for that. You should base one character on one person, like I do. Like
Really?
Hemingway does, yeah.
You could have the ambition and the pretense that you would be able to see so thoroughly into another person's character that no part of you would show up in the description.
And
I'm not sure I believe
No,
that.
I don't either. And I think Fitzgerald wrote him back and rejected.
It all converges on Gatsby, and Gatsby is inexhaustible.
All those people who claim to have a piece of Scott's original raw material in their community, they might have a partial truth.
Everyone's colored by their own prejudice of where they grew up. So when we interview people from Long Island, they're all convinced Gatsby's from Long Island.
The danger of writing a book about Gatsby is that you then hear from all these people all over the world who've got the key.
We're not supposed to read Gatsby and think Westport. That wasn't Fitzgerald's intention. He wanted us to read Gatsby and think Long Island. But since he didn't have those experiences on Long Island, since they came out of his magic year of 1920 on Westport, where he had a beach, he had a cottage next to a mysterious recluse, that's what he's using as his model.
I think the interesting thing about all of these speculations and surmises and everything is that it's great if it enlivens the book. It's awful if it weighs it down.
My father was on the scene when we started to lose our way during Gatsby's time, and he recorded it all. The generosity, the greed, the innocence, and the cynicism, the magnificence and the waste that was America between the two world wars. People read him now for clues and guidelines, as if by understanding him and his beautiful and damned period, they could see more clearly what's wrong.
The thing that jumps out for me is she also puts in and his beautiful and damn period, which is
I can see that puts it right in your movie.
Yeah.
Okay, Michelle. That's it. All right. So are we seeing me? Okay, you're muted.
Thank you. We're going to put you on the main screen, and for those tuning in, you can ask questions.
Oh, fantastic. Most people don't. So let's see if we have a brave soul out there. And thanks again, Michelle.
All right. So, folks, if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll see how many we can get through.
Oh, by the way, what I'll do, if indeed anybody asks a question, but I'll leave everybody with this with you. I think this is a very comforting historical story. Now, we are facing a century later the identical challenges that people did in 1920, right? They were dealing with a pandemic. They were trying to absorb new radical technologies. They were dealing with white supremacy. They were dealing with wide-scale Black Lives Don't Matter moments. And by the way, after all of that, what ended up happening was the Roaring '20s. So, and I'm not the first to, by any means, predict this. But Michelle, Fredericksburg, and anybody out there who's watching, I think we're on the verge of a spectacular rebound, and I think we're going to be seeing the Roaring 2020s. So Michelle, it doesn't look like we have any questions. I really appreciate you being there and doing all the work it took to put this together. Folks out there, it may not look like a lot, but it is. So I appreciate I've just got my second vaccination and it was not fun. So I hope those of you that are getting vaccinated have a better experience than I did. But certainly nice to get that on off the to-do list. All right. So thanks, Michelle. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks. It looks like we do have a question here. So we've got one from Robert. He says, what was there about Zelda that would inspire F. Scott Fitzgerald?
She was, first of all, beautiful. Okay. Now, what is interesting to note is that when you see photos of Zelda, she did not photograph well, but men found her irresistible. All of Scott's friends hit on her. So there was her beauty. There was also her mind. She spoke in this very interesting way of using these non sequiturs but they were very intelligent. And what he would do is he would take her comments and he'd grab a napkin and he'd write down what she wrote, and then he'd use it in a story. He'd grab an envelope, right? And write it. He wrote it on once he had opened up his wallet, he wrote it on like $1 bill. So he inspired himself. He stimulated her, stimulated him in terms of her looks. He stimulated him in terms of her mind. And indeed, what she kept were her diaries, and they're lost now. And it's kind of one of the holy grails of Fitzgerald academia, because what Scott did with these diaries was that he copied from them. So there's a lot of accusations of Scott plagiarizing Zelda, and there's some truth to that. There's no doubt about it. So again, I think by by heart and mind, Robert, by heart and mind. She got him. She got him. And I do see that some people, Nancy, thanks for checking in. Cynthia, Terry, Marlene, Emilio, Cynthia again. I appreciate you thanking me and thanking us. And again, listen, by the way, April 10th, 5 days ago, The Great Gatsby's published. 500,000 copies are printed a year now and sold a year. Keep in mind that only 20,000 were sold in Scott's lifetime. Now it's 500,000 a year. And in a sad coda to the story, when Scott died, all right, when Scott died, his bank account had $13.13 in it. $13.13. Terrible. And now, if he only knew. So again, it's available on all platforms, and Michelle has been kind to get a DVD copy. Gatsby in Connecticut is the award-winning documentary, and my book is what it came out of, the movie came out of, which has all the other information that we couldn't fit in the film based on my research. And by the way, it really is. It's a beautiful coffee table book. There are rare photos in there. It's beautiful quality. Frankly, when people tell me they bought the book, and I said, "Well, did you enjoy it?" They're like, "Oh, I loved it." But then I found out that most of them just look at the pictures. But that's okay too, because they're great pictures, and they're learning. About Fitzgerald. So it looks like questions are done. And Michelle, thank you, and thank you. Thank you, Fredericksburg. Again, been there many, many times. Epicenter of history of the American Civil War. So good night, everybody. Good night, Michelle.
All right. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Take care.